Welcome to Understanding China, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation series dedicated to helping Americans better understand the nature of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party, and key issues in U.S. China relations. I'm Murray Bissett, Director of Academic Programs, and I'm pleased to present to you today Dr. Frank Dikötter, Chair Professor of Humanities at the University of Hong Kong, a Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution, and the world's leading authority on the modern history of China. Frank is the author of numerous books, including a series called The People's Trilogy, which details the history of the People's Republic of China from Mao's victory in 1949 to the Cultural Revolution's end in 1976. You can follow his work at frankdikötter.com. During today's event, China Since the Communist Revolution, Frank will give us an overview of the history of Communist China, which is important given the ongoing efforts of the CCP to rewrite the past. We are truly privileged to have Frank here with us to share his unparalleled knowledge of modern China. Following his presentation, we will have a discussion with Frank drawing upon questions submitted by the audience. You can submit questions for him throughout the event using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And with that, Frank, I welcome you and invite you to share your presentation.
I'm in Hong Kong. It's very dark out there. I'll try to make this as interesting as possible, although quite frankly, I'm zoomed out, and I can imagine that many of the people attending this this event may also be a little bit tired of all the webinars and other Zoom events here. So I'll speak for about half an hour, and I'll cover the entire 20th century. Let me start maybe with a joke. Marxists are apparently very good at predicting the future, but they find it much more difficult to predict the past. That's, of course, an old joke from communist countries. And it really highlights a very simple fact, namely that one-party states tend to rewrite history, if only to shore up their own legitimacy. Of course, communist leaders are not elected at the ballot box, so they have to invoke much broader historical forces to justify their rule. And certainly in our times, I think one of the greatest propaganda coups must be what I refer to as the China story. It is propagated by China. It is quite widespread abroad as well in Europe, parts of Asia, and of course the United States. And this is how the China story goes. Before 1949, when the red flag went up over Tiananmen Square in China, over the Forbidden City, I should say, China was nothing but misery and humiliation. People waiting to be liberated from all of that. Then under Chairman Mao Zedong from 1949 till his death in 76, there was what is referred to as an era of transition, which was very successful, with a few setbacks here and there. And the great turning point really is the advent of Deng Xiaoping, architect of modern reforms, economic reforms, who transforms that very populous country into a superpower. This is the story, the China story, that we've been told again and again and again. I'd like to examine three parts of it. The first one, the Republican era, Republican China, from the moment that the empire collapses in 1911 until 1949. And secondly, I'll focus a little bit more in detail on the Mao years, 49-76. I understand that most of you are interested in that. And I will also say a few words about the last 4 decades, the era of so-called reform and opening up, and I'll examine it a little bit more critically. The purpose really is to give you a framework that spans the entire 20th century, to better understand what happened. Once you've got the framework right, I think it's much easier than to fill it up with readings one can do on one's own. It's often that framework that is very much missing. So let me start with the Republican era. And in particular with a simple anecdote. In 1919, 8 years after the collapse of the empire, there are about 350,000 foreigners who are resident in the Republic of China. Now, by the end of the 20th century, there are only about 300,000 living in China. In fact, today, it's barely more than that. North Korea has more foreigners proportionally to its overall population than the People's Republic of China. North Korea has 0.2. The People's Republic of China has less than 0.1. So what am I saying here? I'm trying to say that the moment the empire collapses, China became a country in which people, goods, and ideas circulated rather widely. It was a golden age of openness that we have still to this day somehow failed to truly recognize and appreciate. So great many foreigners who made the Republic of China their own homes and contributed to it. And equally, as we shall see in a couple of minutes, great many Chinese who went abroad with global flows in and out. Let me take another example. We know that in 1911, the empire collapsed, the Qing Empire is gone, but few of us recognize that the Republic of China was Asia's first republic. It had an electorate of some 40 million people who voted for 30,000 electors, who in turn selected representatives for the National Assembly and the House of Representatives. In other words, China in 1912 achieved a level of a representation of 10%. Something that would not be achieved by Japan till 1928 and India in 1935. Indeed, the entire era is marked by sustained efforts to establish constitutional government, participatory politics, and of course, the rule of law. There was truly a golden age there. So this attempt to build up a parliamentary democracy doesn't just vanish after a few years. We have to bear in mind, for instance, that from 1929 onwards, in many parts of China, in particular the north, village leaders were democratically elected. There were national elections held for a National People's Convention in 1931, and again 4 years later for a National Assembly. This National Assembly never convened because in 1937, as you probably know, the Japanese invaded the north of China, and this was very much the start of the Second World War in Asia. So this National Assembly will only convene a few years after the end of the Second World War in May 1948, and has some 1,400 elected representatives, which at that point in time must have been the largest representative body on planet Earth. And they passed a constitution which had a very lively Bill of Rights with all the basic freedoms enshrined in that constitution. Now, it isn't just participatory politics that mattered during this era. There are also newspapers, which of course were banned under the empire, which appear immediately in the decade following the collapse of the empire in 1911. About 10 years later, you have 1,000 dailies in a dozen languages. And throughout that entire era, up till 48, people vigorously defend the freedom of speech and publication. It goes without saying that a number of journalists were arrested, a few shot. You have to compare the Republic of China to similar regimes at the time in Europe. It was an old democracy. But nonetheless, even in the 1940s, the Da Gongbao, the most widely read newspaper in China, vigorously criticized Chiang Kai-shek, leader of the Nationalist Party. So a lot of concern about freedom of speech, a great many publications that reflect the whole diversity across the political spectrum, but also, interestingly enough, civil society that appears during this era, of course, forbidden under the empire. The moment it collapses after 1911, you see a whole thriving civil society appear, whether these are powerful, independent chambers of commerce, all the way down to informal beggar unions. And that civil society, religious communities, study societies, contribute greatly to a very vibrant civic environment. But most of all, I think one must point out that before the 20th century, there is no rule of law in the modern sense of the term in the empire. Yet even before the collapse, around about 1904, the empire itself, the Qing themselves, initiate a number of legal reforms. They set up a Ministry of Justice, a Supreme Court. They establish a modern court system, a network of prisons. They abolish bodily punishment, and of course, codes, civil, criminal, common law codes are being drafted, a constitution prepared. It is probably one of the most remarkable features of the entire Republican era, the extent to which at all social levels, there's a real, true desire to separate out powers and establish an independent judicial system and rule of law. Some of the most well-known lawyers are active abroad. Take Wang Chonghui, somebody you may not have heard of, but he becomes the man who publishes the standard English translation of the German criminal code. Others, like Zhang Tianxi, become judges at the International Court of Justice. A great many, and by that I mean thousands upon thousands, of people in the court system, in the prison system, in the judicial system have been trained abroad. And of course, they are not the only ones to go abroad and seek modern knowledge. There are literally tens of thousands of students who study every field, from avionics all the way down to zoology and the alphabet. And by the 1930s and 40s, have established themselves as peers in their fields, capable of engaging their peers in Europe, United States, Japan, and elsewhere. Very much a golden age of openness. Now, let me move on to the second part, which starts after the Second World War, and which leads to the end of this Republican era, in which so much time and effort was spent to build up an open, thriving civil society with a rule of law and participatory politics. And probably the key moment there is not so much the foundation of the Chinese Communist Party, but the moment in August 1945 when Stalin decides to send in the Red Army through Manchuria, the north of China, into Korea to meet his American counterparts along the 38th parallel. On their way, the Soviets, of course, occupy the entire region north of the Great Wall of China. And they stay even after the end of the war. And they really help Chairman Mao and his ragtag army of guerrilla fighters to become a modern fighting machine. By 1948, after the Americans had abandoned Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, a wartime ally, the communists are strong enough to start besieging entire cities in Manchuria. Changchun, one of these cities, is blockaded for 5 months in 1948. After 160 ordinary civilians are starved to death, finally the city collapses. And of course, other cities are extremely fearful of undergoing the same fate and surrender one after the other, like dominoes. Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists flee to Taiwan at the end of 1949. In a nutshell, liberation is not so much people applauding the arrival of the communists. It's the result of a bloody, brutal civil war that lasts for several years. Now, when that red flag finally goes up in 1949 and Mao Zedong establishes the People's Republic of China, one of the first things that happens in the countryside is something that is referred to as land reform. In fact, it has rather little to do with land and much more to do with local politics. In fact, that is the revolution. As Communist Party members in villages, with the backing, of course, of the army, compel villagers to denounce a small number of carefully targeted individuals who are portrayed as landlords or traitors or tyrants, in effect compelling the population to overthrow the power holders, including, of course, democratically elected village leaders. Farmers, villagers who refuse to participate run the risk of being targeted themselves. So by the end of 1950, roughly 2 million people denounced as landlords have been humiliated, beaten up, and literally murdered in a pact of blood sealed between the poor and the party. Their possessions are distributed to the villagers, implicating all of them in a crime from which there's no turning back. So that, in effect, becomes the revolution, as farmers all gain an extra little bit of land from which those many millions have been dispossessed. 2 million are murdered, many more are stigmatized for life. That's land reform. A year later, in October 1951, as China enters the Korean War, Mao uses the opportunity to launch a great terror. He wishes to eliminate all those who stand in the way of revolution. These could be people he sees as spies or bandits or counter-revolutionaries. And he hands down a killing quota of 1 per 1,000, in effect asking the communist cells at the local level to publicly execute 1 for every 1,000 in the local population. But in many parts, in particular in the South, local cows are keen to show their revolutionary fervor. So they kill 2 to 3 times as many. Sometimes entire villages are razed to the ground. School children as young as 6 years old are denounced as spies working for the nationalists who are now in Taiwan and are tortured to death. Sometimes party members simply take a few prisoners to meet the quota and execute them. Most of the executions take place in public rallies and stadiums that people are forced to attend, of course, but a great many people are also vanished, so to speak, deep inside the forest, along rivers, besides ravines, alone or in batches, roughly 2 million people. By the count of the very Bureau of Statistics, the bean counters in the party who keep tags on how many people are executed in each province. By their own account, roughly 2 million are eliminated by the time this campaign reaches its end in 1952. Of course, violence, to paraphrase what Simon Schama said of the French Revolution, violence was the revolution. It was all about violence. But violence only has to be exercised once in a while in order to instill fear. So fear and intimidation are far more widespread. People are forced to turn themselves into what the party calls new people. They have to go to improvised schools and factories and offices. They have to read newspaper editorials and the writings of Chairman Mao, the classics of Marxism, Leninism. They must shout the right slogans, learn the right answers to the right questions. And most of all, whether in front of assembled crowds or closely monitored in supervisory sessions, they must constantly confess to their crimes, examine their past, prove their loyalty to the party. Of course, there's more than just violence, fear, intimidation. Very much like Lenin and the Bolsheviks, Mao makes promises to very different groups of people. Like the Bolsheviks, Mao promises freedom of speech for intellectuals. He promises better living conditions for workers, protection of private property for businessmen, and of course, independence for ethnic minorities and more land for the villagers. One by one, these promises are broken as one social group after the other is very much reined in and reduced very much to, what could you say, serve them, really. Take, for instance, the villagers. By 1956, a few years after liberation, as 1949 is referred to, the land that they had been given in exchange for them denouncing the power holders at the time, that land is now taken back and collectivized. And farmers become really bonded servants at the back and call of local cadres. They must produce grain and sell it to the state at state mandated prices. By 1956, all major enterprises have been expropriated and are nationalized. Private property in terms of a shop, a corner shop or a factory or a farm no longer exists. Not only that, but that thriving civil society that had very much flourished during the Republican era from 1911 to 49 is eliminated. In effect, the Communist Party of China, like other organizations, for instance, in the Soviet Union, but also in Germany under Adolf Hitler, all organizations outside of the organization of the party are eliminated, whether these are religious communities or study societies or charitable organizations. All of them are either incorporated within the structures of the party or simply closed down. There's not much left between the individual and the party. In 1958, Mao goes further with what he calls a great leap forward in the countryside, as hundreds of millions of farmers are herded into even greater, bigger collectives called people's communes. The idea here is that if Mao can transform every man and every woman in the countryside into a foot soldier in a giant army to be deployed day and night to transform the economy, then he can parachute this country into a future utopia, a country of plenty for all. Of course, it backfires very badly as these villagers become bonded servants and are exploited by local parties keen to achieve ever greater quotas. Tens of millions of ordinary people are literally beaten, worked, or starved to death. It is a massive man-made catastrophe. And of course, at the end of it, around about 1962, having to face what he has done to the very backbone of the revolution, the so-called peasants, Mao becomes fearful that he might meet the very same fate as Joseph Stalin, who was, of course, denounced by his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, in a campaign of de-Stalinization. Mao fears that the same might happen to his legacy, possibly even before he dies. So he starts plotting a campaign that he will refer to as the Cultural Revolution. It starts several years later in 1966. In fact, the Cultural Revolution is seen as a campaign to get rid of bourgeois, capitalist, feudal culture that stands in the way of pure proletarian culture. But Mao also uses the campaign to allow ordinary people, Red Guards, for instance, to criticize party members and scrutinize their background to see whether or not they might be opposed to him or whether they might have criticized the Great Leap Forward. This results in chaos. In fact, Mao is the only one leader in the communist world to ever have allowed ordinary people to take party members to task. And of course, people do so with relish. Some of the leading cadres in Beijing are taken down, imprisoned, a few tortured to death. But it results in almost civil war, as many of these ordinary people also turn into factions against each other. Red Guards fight other Red Guards. In 1968, Mao asks the army to intervene and reassert order. The army from 68 to 71 turns China into literally a garrison state with soldiers overseeing factories, offices, universities. One of the first acts is to send to the countryside literally millions of young people who took Mao at his word when he asked them to criticize members of the Communist Party at the start of the Cultural Revolution in 66. But of course, Mao is fearful of the army too. He's now rather paranoid, as he well should be. And in 71, one of the leaders in the army, Lin Biao, dies mysteriously in a plane accident. At this point, the army itself becomes a victim of the Cultural Revolution and is purged in turn as soldiers return to their barracks. By 1971, after 2 decades of relentless campaigns and violence, most ordinary people are tired of revolution. In particular, in the countryside, the credibility of communism has been destroyed by the catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward, during which tens of millions died. But people also realize that during the Cultural Revolution, the organization of the party has been very badly damaged. So they use the opportunity, the void created, the chaos created by the Cultural Revolution, to very quietly, in what I refer to as a silent revolution, return to more traditional practices. Surreptitiously, they start dividing the land, frequently actually with the support of the local cadres, who themselves, of course, have been victimized during the Cultural Revolution as well. They divide the land. They open up black markets. They share out the tools. They operate underground factories. In effect, they go capitalist, quote unquote. Mao dies. A few years later, Deng Xiaoping comes to power. Now, this is the start of part 3, the final part. I'll be quite brief about it. Deng Xiaoping is portrayed as the architect of economic reforms. But the truth is that Deng Xiaoping in the beginning was very much opposed to what was happening in the countryside. But there's very little he could do about it. Ordinary people, in millions and millions of acts of defiance, claimed back very basic economic freedoms from the state. They started cultivating the land as they saw fit. They started trading among themselves. And it is the people rather than the party who are the true architects of economic reform. In effect, the countryside creates great economic growth throughout the 1980s, which then triggers back to the cities. Deng Xiaoping is a very smart man. When he realizes that there's not much he can do about it, he allows it to happen. And he uses economic growth to rebuild the party that has been so badly damaged by Chairman Mao during the Cultural Revolution. So from there onwards, really, it is a tale of, on the one hand, basic economic freedoms, on the other hand, a complete lack of political freedoms. The party is determined to, on the one hand, allow people to more or less get on with it, but to not give way to any of their political aspirations. There are many twists and turns in this story, including, of course, the massacre that happened around Tiananmen Square in June 1989. But the point really is that despite the lack of political freedoms, entrepreneurial guile manages to create economic growth after 3 decades of disaster under Mao. It has been acclaimed as a miracle. Was it? Well, it's very debatable. If you take the gross domestic product per capita, in world rankings, China went from number 126 in 1979 to 121 10 years later on the eve of the Tiananmen massacre. It stays there for a good decade until 1999, and then finally inches up another 4 points by 2007. So from 126 to 116 between 79 and 2007. It ranks between Zimbabwe, which is rather corrupt, and Turkmenistan. Not exactly a great accomplishment. Still, it is true that after the financial crisis in 2008, the economy does take off to a much greater extent. In fact, people who know China from 20, 30 years ago might barely recognize it. It looks like a different country. Skyscrapers, bullet trains, brand new airports, entire cities have appeared apparently out of nowhere. But scratch that glimmering surface and you will find the iron underpinnings of the one-party state very much in place. The very institutions on which Mao relied after 1949 to impose his will are still in place. There's a propaganda department. There's a Ministry of Public Security and a Ministry for State Security. There's, of course, the Bureau of Statistics that churned out all these fake numbers during the Great Leap Forward to portray it as an economic miracle. And is still there to produce the numbers required by the party. Of course, there's the People's Liberation Army. Like all organizations that invoke the name of the people, they are an instrument that belongs exclusively to the party to impose its will on the people. In fact, what Mao did after 49 is make sure that civil society disappears, and the party is in an exclusive position to have access to the wealth of the country. That has not fundamentally changed. The very institutions of the party have been spruced up. But most importantly, the land still belongs to the state. The banks belong to the state. Industry belongs to the state. And most enterprises, directly or indirectly, still belong to the state. Economists have noticed that consumption levels are very low. They're low because the wealth trickles to the state, which is controlled by the party. There is no rule of law and no judicial independence which might guarantee private property, unlike the decades before 1949, when this was painstakingly built up. In effect, not even billionaires can be quite sure how to protect their property, except, of course, by sending their assets and families abroad. But occasionally these billionaires, one or two of them, disappear while others scramble to prove their allegiance to the party. One might very well argue that there are great benefits to having a powerful one-party state with the monopoly over power. One might argue that separation of powers creates weaknesses, whereas a monopoly over power creates certain advantages, in particular in times of economic instability. While you might, there is nothing to indicate in the history of the People's Republic from 49 till this day, there's nothing to indicate that the party will undertake meaningful economic or political reform. Its hand is everywhere and will not move of its own accord. To think otherwise is to follow the China story, whereas what we should be doing is look at the facts and history. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank, for an incredibly wide-ranging presentation. Before we proceed, I just want to remind those in attendance that you can submit questions for Frank via the Q&A function, which is found at the bottom of your screen. Now, let's turn to some of the questions attendees have already sent in. To begin, I'd like to ask you about something that I've heard argued a few times. And that's that the Sino-Soviet split can significantly be traced to Khrushchev's abandonment of Stalinism, which Mao understood as an abandonment of communism itself. So to what extent is Mao, his political practice, his thought, dependent on the example of Stalin and Lenin and their thinking? And what impact do you believe the Cultural Revolution has for China's leaders today?
Oh, these are two very good questions. I would say that ultimately, Mao is Stalin. Let me rephrase it. It is Stalin who supports the Communist Party from the 1920s onwards. It is he who provides the funds. It is he who helps turn that ragtag army of guerrilla parties into a fighting machine after 1945. There are slogans after 1949 telling people that today's Soviet Union is our tomorrow. The example of Stalin and the Soviet Union is everywhere. There are literally tens of thousands of Soviet advisors underground in the early 1950s. So a lot is copied directly from the Soviet Union. But of course, deep down, Mao thinks of himself as a much greater leader than Stalin himself. It is Mao, I imagine, he thinks, I imagine, who has brought a quarter of humanity into the socialist camp, not Stalin. And it is Mao who has fought the Americans and United Nations to a standstill in the Korean War, not Stalin. So when Stalin dies, Mao is pretty much determined to take on the mantle of the socialist camp. But of course, that's not what happened. Khrushchev does. And that's That's where it really rubs. So you could say to some extent that, I say this in my book, that the Great Leap Forward is also an attempt to show up Khrushchev and the Soviet Union, to show the socialist camp that Mao can be far more successful than the Soviets have ever been. Of course, it backfires terribly, terribly, terribly. It's a disaster which has to be covered up very carefully. But then again, Mao tries with the Cultural Revolution to portray himself as somehow a cut above the rest. The Cultural Revolution is meant to somehow defend the Communist Revolution against revisionism. The idea here is that we will go straight from Marxism to Leninism to Mao Zedong thought. Stalin is cut out altogether. But having said that, a great number of dictators do this. They all portray themselves as the end line of a number of great revolutionaries that start with Uncle Carl through Lenin. Kim Il-sung does the same thing in North Korea. What are the results of the Cultural Revolution for the leadership today? I think it's very simple. It's very straightforward. There are one intended and one unintended consequence. The unintended consequence of a decade of entrenched fear and chaos is that ordinary people in the countryside use the opportunity to claim back basic freedoms. That's the start of economic reform. It comes from ordinary people who are sick and tired of seeing, famine and starvation in their villages. But for the party members, of course, it's an intended consequence, and the consequence is that they're determined to never allow ordinary people to speak up again. The very term that Mao uses in 1966 as he launches the Cultural Revolution, first with the Red Guards, then later on in November 66, ordinary people, are allowed to speak up and criticize party members. The term he uses is great democracy. So in the mind of a great many party members, including the man in charge today, democracy is the Cultural Revolution. Cultural Revolution is what happens when you allow ordinary people to speak critically of the party, and they're determined to never allow that to happen again.
Thank you. So you just mentioned that dictators often seek to portray themselves as the end result, the end of a long line of revolutionary heroes and revolutionary thought. Is Xi Jinping doing this? And how does he seek to articulate the Xi Jinping thought, which, if I'm not mistaken, there's actually a book by that title, is the culmination or end result of Mao Zedong thought?
Yes, of course. It's never enough to be a revolutionary and kill lots of people. You must have your name enshrined in the constitution and preferably have a philosophy that finishes with an ism, like Maoism, or Cadarism, or Ceausescuism, or Kimism. But of course, they all do this. Deng Xiaoping has Deng Xiaoping theory. Jiang Zemin, I believe, has the Jiang Zemin 3 represents. So they must all come up with some sort of philosophical contribution to the foundation of Marxism-Leninism. But Xi Jinping, I think, I'm no expert, I'm a historian, right? And I like to look at evidence, in particular in the archives, which is not possible for Xi Jinping. It's too early, too soon for that. But it seems to me that it's very interesting that Xi Jinping is trying almost to somehow obfuscate or possibly even write out of history Deng Xiaoping. In other words, he wants to have an almost direct line from Mao, and then the next great leader is Xi Jinping, and Deng appears somehow as a fumbling figure in between. Whereas until recently, Deng Xiaoping, of course, in the China story, was acclaimed as the architect of economic reform. I think that is very, very interesting. Of course, dictators, all of them, somehow teeter between hubris on the one hand and paranoia on the other. Hubris, great grandiose ideas, a great leap forward, a cultural revolution. Xi Jinping, father of the nation. and the other paranoia, this constant fear that others will do to them what they do to others, that somebody will stab them in the back, organize a coup, depose them. That's the fate of the dictator.
Well, it's always justly deserved. So the West believed that engagement with China, that opening to China and China opening to us would lead eventually to its liberalization, not only economically, but also politically. But I think that subsequent history has shown that is just mistaken. It's wrong. That is not what has happened. And the hope that it will happen in the future, I think, is misguided. Why did we get this so wrong? And a related question, why is it that so many mistakenly believe that the PRC today is more capitalist than communist?
It's not capitalist because capitalism relies on the rule of law. It's a very simple point that many people who debate the merits of socialism versus capitalism forget. There's no such thing as capitalism outside of a democratic contact with the rule of law. You need the rule of law and an independent judicial system to protect your private property. Otherwise, there's no such thing as capitalism. So in the constitution, in the PRC, so-called socialist public property is inviolable, but not private property. Now, to come back to the key point about engagement, this is a massive mistake. Why and how? It's a very long story. Americans in particular have always been enamored with China. They were not part of those imperialist powers, God forbid, Europeans who of course have a bad history. Many Americans were missionaries. There's a great sense of goodwill there. So that's one part of the story. But ultimately, the key point must be that when we talk about China, we always talk about culture when we should be talking about politics. And this is, of course, part of the China story. The confusion between the party and the people, but also between the party and Chinese culture. But the Communist Party of China has nothing to do with Chinese culture. These are two separate things. You would not talk about the Soviet Union and then forget about politics and just look at Russian culture. It wouldn't occur to anyone during the Cold War to do that. Yet that is precisely the mistake that people have made with the People's Republic of China. In particular, the mistake was to think that they are not really communist. The Americans made this mistake on 3 occasions. First, before 1949, when they abandoned Chiang Kai-shek, believing that Mao Zedong was somehow not a communist, but an agrarian reformer, somebody who was straightforward, close to his people. The second mistake was probably Nixon, Kissinger. These people are not true communists, unlike the Soviet Union. If we can trade with them, then of course political reform will follow as surely as the cart follows the ox. And the third one, of course, was Bill Clinton after the Tiananmen massacre. Again, the same story. We really must keep these people inside this global community and help them move forward. But all along, and this is crystal clear on the basis of documents that are frequently public and occasionally in archives, and all along, whether it is Mao, Deng, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, or Xi Jinping, the democracy is always portrayed as the enemy, as the capitalist camp. The capitalist camp is always out there to somehow instigate trouble and overthrow the Communist Party of China. This goes back to what I said earlier on hubris and paranoia. They're paranoid about any realm of freedom inside their own country, but also beyond. So by definition, Europeans, Japanese, United States are an enemy, whether you like it or not. So appeasement to me sounds like appeasing a bully. It will be perceived as weakness, and the bully will bully you even more. The key point is to understand the difference between culture and politics, to understand the political system. The key point is to apply one single standard the same way we do with Europeans, the same way we did with the Soviet Union. One standard, not two. The pretext is always China's different, but it's not different. Would we have entrusted the Soviet Union with producing, for instance, our pharmaceutical products? I don't think so. Would we have set up factories in Eastern Europe? I don't think so. Would we have trusted them to somehow come up with political reform by helping them economically? I don't think so. China is no exception.
Thank you. So many policy experts on China have a bunch of mistaken preconceptions. One of them is that China is just simply a developing country. That they don't recognize that throughout history, it's been the CCP that either through land reform policies or state-owned enterprises and other policy instruments, they've determined who gets rich, who remains poor, who ends up poor. How can we correct that perception? And moreover, and because I think that this is somewhat related, why is it that most people don't know what the organization department of China is, and why it's important to understanding the People's Republic of China? Exactly.
So United States, Europe had plenty of experts of the Soviet Union and communism in general. Any professor of history would have been able to tell you what is an organization department, but today people just stare at you. Organization department is the department that appoints a party secretary to every institution that matters, including history departments like mine, if I were across the border in the People's Republic of China. So why this misconception? Why this idea that somehow, why is it that we could understand the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and other communist regimes, Cuba for instance, but not China? I think deep down, it comes down to it's a very simple term called racism, Orientalism. These people are different. They're not like us. They're not real communists. They're cute. They're pretty. They're on their way towards development. We should help them. It's a sort of racism in that when it comes to the Soviet Union, we know exactly what's happening. When it comes to the People's Republic of China, same institutions, same background, same organization department, same propaganda department, same Bureau of Statistics, same campaign, same results, same planned economy, same attempt at reform. We don't see it. We don't recognize it. We can't see it because we're blinded by that image of China as some sort of culture, mythical culture.
Thank you. In Mao's Great Famine, you estimate that approximately 45 million people perished as a result of the actions of the communist authorities during a time of peace. And it's important to emphasize that, during a time of peace. Now, within the last year, the People's Republic of China became the longest lasting communist dictatorship in world history. What has been the human toll of more than 70 years of communist rule in China? And can you maybe shed a little bit of light on the process by which you come to this determination and the kinds of evidence used?
Yeah, so there are under Mao, the three periods. The first years, so-called land reform, the Great Terror, you might call that calculated, intentional murder, in that Mao himself gives a killing quota of 1 per 1,000 for the campaign that runs from October 1950 to October 1951. And the rough count is about 4 to 5 million people who vanished. Then the Great Leap Forward is unintended murder. These are mass killings, but they're unintended through neglect or occasionally deliberate starvation when food is used as a weapon against ordinary people. There are two groups of people who have made estimates about that. There are those who have looked at archival evidence. There is me, I say at least 45 million. There's Yuxi Guang, who visited dozens and dozens of county archives over a period of 20 years, puts the number 55 million. And then there is a team of researchers who went around in the 1980s looking at the evidence, and they too came up with the number 50 million. And then there are those who look at the published literature, and their estimates vary from anything 16 up to 38. Well, these are the two different groups. The key point must be that if we look beyond the mass killings at the entire communist period, then there are two things that matter, I think, in terms of living standards. One is that the living standards by the end of the Mao era in 76, 77, 78, that the overall average living standards were lower than they were in 1948, which is quite extraordinary. And the main reason for that is because the state, of course, appropriated most of the surplus. And then the interesting thing is, if you look from 78, 9 till today, of course, it's a completely different world today. But ultimately, the issue economically is that there is not enough consumption. And the reason for that is again the same, namely that the share, the household share in terms of income of the gross domestic product is actually the lowest of any country in history. In other words, a great many people in China are not very well off at all, and their bank savings and assets are being used by party members and those who profit from it, by the state. In other words, the state and people linked to it are very well off. Ordinary people have very low living standards, which is why they can't consume, which is also why there aren't all that many private enterprises in the first place, because there isn't enough demand for it. So all along, whether it is physical repression or today financial repression, ordinary people are the losers in this story.
Thank you, Frank. For the last question, I kind of want to go back to the future in a certain way. You mentioned that China before Mao was more open, more vibrant, more cosmopolitan, more democratic. I'm pretty certain that that's new information for most people. Now, when America was creating its republic, the founders were looking to the thought of Enlightenment thinkers like Locke and Montesquieu. What were the intellectual foundations of the Republican efforts in China? And what might that Republican era tell us about the long-term potential for freedom in China?
So we're looking at exactly the same thing: Montesquieu, Voltaire, Rousseau, Edison, science, all the great minds of modern civilization. And they were quite determined to build up a civilization that was comparable, if not better, than what one could find in Europe, Japan, the United States. Japan before it became fascist, of course, and Europe before Adolf Hitler, Mussolini, and others. They were really looking at democracy, at constitutional governments, at the rule of law as the goals to be achieved at all levels of society. And that's the most interesting thing about the Republican era. It spans that entire first half of the 20th century, and it tells you something very, very interesting, namely that there is a historical precedent for an open China that thrives in diversity and is keen to engage with the rest of the world on equal terms. So there are precedents there.
Thank you, Frank. Not only for joining us, but also for your ongoing work to chronicle the true story of China. Future generations will owe you a debt of gratitude when they seek to understand what actually has happened in the world's most populous country. And thank you all for joining us. If you would like to follow Frank's work, you can visit frankdikötter.com. And please join us for our next event in the Understanding China series, which will take place Tuesday, May 5th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. The subject will be the CCP's invasion of Latin America, during which we will hear from Dr. Carlos Ponce, Senior Fellow and Director of Latin American Programs at VOC, and a 28-year veteran working in the fields of governance, civil society development, and human rights and democracy empowerment in the U.S., Latin America, and the Caribbean. You can find more information about the event and about the work of the VOC China Studies team at victimsofcommunism.org. For the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, I'm Murray Bissett. Thank you all. Have a great day and remain healthy.